Today is World Population Day, so I just wanted to make a short video to talk to you about that. One thing many people often say about the climate crisis is that it's caused by overpopulation. There are a lot of problems with this, which I'm just going to outline here. First of all, it shifts the blame away from privileged countries like those in Europe and North America onto places in continents like Africa and Asia. Why? Because of the typical rhetoric that people in those continents have more children, and therefore overpopulation is their issue, and therefore it is what's destroying the planet, and that it's their fault. Firstly, why do people say this? Well, it's quite convenient, isn't it? Because it means we don't have to do anything, those of us here in these privileged countries. We can blame other countries which are struggling and suffering and maybe don't have access to the resources we do for having too many kids. Firstly, this isn't even true. There are many richer countries which have about the same birth rates as poorer countries. For example, and I quote this book here that I have, the only remaining region with high fertility rates is sub-Saharan Africa, but here rates also declining rapidly and continue to see an acceleration in the decline of fertility rates. It took around 80 years for fertility rates in the UK to reduce by a quarter from just over 6 to 4.5 children per woman. In Rwanda, a similar reduction took just 5 years. So, first of all, even if overpopulation was the issue, it isn't true that it is the poorer countries or typically countries in Africa and Asia which are just to blame. A lot of people also blame China, and here I have another statistic about that. This trend isn't limited to high-income nations. Today, Chinese-born women living in China have only 1.6 children on average, lower than the UK's 1.8. It is worth noting that China's fertility trend had begun before the one-child policy was introduced in 1979. Speaking of the one-child policy, a lot of people use this argument to say that was a good thing. Of course that wasn't a good thing. It had huge humanitarian consequences, it had horrible consequences for so many people. And, that is not a good idea. No one should be saying that is a good idea. If they are, that is not at all what we want to be talking about as regards the climate, because that's just promoting complete loss of freedom. As regards poorer nations always having more children, here is another statistic to just bust that. Bangladesh's fertility rate is 2.1 children per woman with an income per capita of $1,510 per year, while Bahrain's is 2 at $23,644 per year. There you can see there's barely any difference between those two countries which have massively different incomes. So blaming poorer countries is first of all just a lie. Secondly, talking about overpopulation deflects attention from the real issues we are facing. Real issues which are caused by emitting too much CO2, which are caused by colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, which are caused by the taking away of indigenous lands, which are caused by burning down forests, and so on. So it isn't overpopulation that is causing these issues. Thirdly, even if this were the issue that some people make it out to be, the fact is we still shouldn't be blaming these people for it and saying they should just have less children. The people who perpetuate the overpopulation myths are often the same sorts of people who would not then be willing to go and support education for girls in the global south, and access to resources like family planning and contraception, all of which would help reduce the population rate if that were the true issue. Supporting access to resources like this is of course important, whether overpopulation is a climate issue or not, and so the people who go on about it being their fault aren't trying to think of ways to fix it, they're simply deflecting blame. It isn't about populations because the vast majority of the world's population are not living outside the planetary boundaries. I heard a statistic the other day which was something like the world's 8 richest men own about as much as the bottom half in terms of income of the world's population, showing that it's only a small minority that live outside the planetary boundaries. And who is this minority? It's privileged people in countries in Europe and North America especially. So when we blame poorer countries for having too many children, we're denying the fact that the real issues are caused by those who live outside the planetary boundaries, namely those same people who usually say overpopulation is the issue. The amount of population isn't the problem, it's how that population lives their lives. And most of the populations in the countries and continents that we blame for this issue due to overpopulation are in fact those who emit the least. For example, it takes a citizen in the UK just 5 days to emit as much as a citizen in Rwanda emits in an entire year. And our emissions of CO2 or CO2 equivalent per capita are almost twice the global average, whereas many citizens and countries are in fact living below the global average of about 4 tons CO2 equivalent per capita. What do all these statistics boil down to? Basically, the people creating the issues are not people in the global south supposedly having too many children, which we've already figured out basically isn't true. It's in fact people in richer and more privileged countries emitting too much, having too much, and it's cultures of consumerism which are creating these issues. It's not people having families. I could go on forever, but in a nutshell, firstly, a lot of the things that people talk about as regards the overpopulation issue in fact aren't true. Like poorer countries don't necessarily have more children. Secondly, it is not population that is the issue, but how these populations live their lives. So it is in fact the minority that is living outside the planetary boundaries that is the main issue. Thirdly, people who say this are usually trying to deflect blame from themselves and their communities and their activities. Fourthly, if you really think overpopulation is a big issue, what you need to be doing is supporting resources like education and family planning rather than preaching about how it's not our fault so we don't have to do anything. And lastly, it is in fact those poorer populations who are suffering the most due to the climate crisis, so maybe we could stop blaming them for it and start taking some accountability and acting on it so that they don't have to suffer anymore.